All right, it's good to go.
Hello, and welcome to Week 6 review for AP Environmental Science. This week's topics are island biogeography, ecological tolerance, and natural disruptions to ecosystems. Last week, I kind of introduced this important figure in APES, biologist E.O. Wilson, who really pioneered a lot of the concepts that we have been discussing in this unit around biodiversity. So we're actually going to talk about one very particular contribution that he and another scientist and ecologist, Robert MacAuthur, sort of pioneered, which is island biogeography. So in the 1960s, they did a few experiments on what type of characteristics of islands influence the biodiversity that is found there. So let's look at the first type of characteristic that's really important here. So say you have a large mainland where you have few islands that are at different distances from the mainland. So in an island chain or maybe just a lone island. The distance from the mainland can be really important when it comes to the community richness or the biodiversity that is found on each island, because the distance needed in order for organisms to migrate from the mainland to these islands increases as the distance, is greater from islands that are farther away. So just by probability of whether or not a creature will successfully immigrate from the mainland to the island decreases as you increase the distance. This over time will then cause islands closer to the mainland to be more biodiverse than islands that are more farther away. So distance is not the only consideration here. Size is also really, really important. So say you have a really large island that is the same distance away from the mainland than a smaller island. Even though there's the same probability that species will immigrate from the mainland to these islands, the smaller island will typically be less biodiverse only because it lacks all of the resources and different ecological niches that these organisms could occupy. So in general, for theory of island biogeography, there's a few rules. As island area increases, the number of species tend to increase. And as the distance from the mainland increases, the number of species tend to decrease. So this also has something to do with another concept, the species area curve or the species area relationship. So if you take a habitat area of, say, 65 meters squared, typically you can find maybe between 30 and 25 different species there. As you decrease the habitat area, that number of species decreases slightly, but not that much. Then as you get smaller and smaller, the area decreases smaller and smaller. The impact on species diversity is greater in relation to the decrease in the habitat area. And this is because you are reducing the amount of resources available for diverse food chains. You are also decreasing the habitat that the organisms can occupy for nesting sites, dens. It makes it more difficult for them to be able to find mates in this smaller area, so you decrease reproduction. This all leads to an increased rate of these species disappearing from smaller and smaller habitats. So if you put all of this information together, you come up with these equilibrium curves. And so equilibrium just means that there is a balance between the speciation or the diversifying nature of an island versus the probability of certain species going extinct. So for both of these curves, we can look at the distance from the mainland and the size of the island. So here, as you look at the increasing species richness, islands that are closer to the mainland in general just have a higher rate of colonization. It's easier for species to get to those islands. Distant islands have a decreased rate of that. If the island then is distant and also small, then that's going to cause there to be a smaller amount of species richness that tends to be on the island. That's the equilibrium point here. But if the island is larger and closer to the mainland, that means that the equilibrium point is higher. So just as a general rule, the larger the island, the more species richness. The closer to the island is to the mainland, the more species richness. So this theory has some other applications, not just about pieces of land that are found in the ocean. So we often think about this as islands on land. And this is especially important with habitat fragmentation due to human impacts. So when we look at forests that have been fragmented, like this one here, you have a standing area of trees that are surrounded by open areas. This is especially important in larger parts of ecosystems that have been disturbed. So in the eastern United States, for example, there's really only patches of deciduous forest that remain. This is due to urbanization and agricultural land use. So we have forests, but they are in these small patches. They're islands on land. Because of this, species, especially of songbirds, are disappearing from those patches. This kind of fragmentation is leading to lower immigration rates between the patches of forest and therefore higher extinction rates because of a decrease in resources. So this is another example of how edge effects can really affect what's going on within these islands on land. So if you took AP biology, this might look a little familiar to you because it's kind of like that diffusion of cubes experiment. So if you have a larger habitat patch, the edge area is only going to affect a certain portion of it. But here, inside the patch is pretty much fine. As you start to decrease the area of the patch, though, the proximity of the rest of the habitat is closer and closer to the edges. And so you have more influences within the entire habitat patch. And again, once you get to such a small area here, almost all of the habitat is impacted by edge effects. So what exactly are edge effects? When you have a clearing of trees and you have this really stark boundary, it causes the soil and the vegetation on these edges to be more prone to drying out, not being able to retain enough moisture because of increased exposure to wind and sunlight. For some biomes, this also makes it more prone for forest fires. This also increases the exposure of animals that live within these patches to predators and competitors. So imagine if you had, say, songbirds, like in the last example, trying to move over here to this smaller patch. Within that movement, they are now exposed and could lead to increased predation and a decrease in their population. Also, these edges are usually really good habitats for things like pests. They take advantage of the disturbance that are along the edges here, and they can proliferate and do really well. Mosquitoes are one example of pests that do really, really well, say when we build a road and through a forest. They tend to have higher populations on the edges of forests than they do within. So this kind of leads us to the next kind of question about what determines biodiversity of an area. This is also something that I brought up in the first week of review, and that is ecological tolerance. So you may remember this diagram of fish and their optimum temperature range. So just to kind of review this idea, all populations, all species have abiotic factors that they can exist in, and it's usually some type of range. So in this example, we have temperature of the water, and these fish prefer to be in this general temperature zone. That doesn't mean that they can't exist in the extremes, but that tends to increase the physiological stress on the animal. So they don't stay there, or they can't stay there for very long. Then there are the outer limits of the temperature spectrum that they cannot exist in. So why does this happen? Well, all individuals in a population are somewhat genetically different from each other. That means that each of these fish have slightly different genes or mutations within those genes that could enable some of them to be more tolerant of the lower temperatures and some to be more tolerant of the higher temperatures. Because of this natural variation within populations, they can evolve over time in response to shifts in these environmental gradients. So if these fish are in a freshwater lake that typically has this temperature, but over time the temperature slowly shifts, that means that the organisms that could occupy those higher temperatures are now at an advantage and may do better at these higher temperatures. One note here, this is a little bit different than acclimating to a different temperature. That's more to do with the range of tolerance that they can have, but that's not adaptation. Adaptation requires there to be a change in the gene pool of the population. So one of the things that you will encounter on the APES exam is how do you test for ecological tolerance within a species or a population. So this is one of the topics that they take, that they give you the opportunity to talk about how you might design an experiment around ecological tolerance. So some examples could be, brine shrimp and their ability to hatch in different salinities. What are the pH tolerance of different species of plants? This might have you calculate pH, which we'll get into in just a second. What is the temperature tolerance of fish, like in the last example? Or even, what are the sunlight needs for primary productivity, either on land or maybe in a coral reef? So what you need to remember about this are the aspects of really good experimental design. So let's go through an example. Say we take the brine shrimp hatching in different salinities, and on a free response question, they ask you to design an experiment that tests the brine shrimp's ability to do this. Well, the first thing that you're going to want to identify is your hypothesis. So brine shrimp, brine, salty, they are going to hatch more frequently in differing salinities, probably higher salinities. So as salinity increases, the probability of egg hatching increases as well. This is not the only way that you could test this. You could look at the mortality of the brine shrimp. You could look at the different pHs of the water, but this is just one example. So within this hypothesis, you also need to be able to sort of operationally define your independent variable and your dependent variable. And what's always important on free response rubrics when it comes to experimental design is making sure that you have multiple different changes to your independent variable. So in this case, if I want to test how increasing salinity affects egg hatching, I need to make sure that I've got multiple different experimental conditions. I also need to be very specific about the dependent variable that I'm going to be tracking in the experiment. So what am I actually measuring in order to know what the independent variable is doing? And in this case, I'm just going to look at the percent of eggs that hatch within each salinity. You always also want to be very specific when identifying your control. In this case, it's the 0.0 solution. There isn't any salt. And you also want to include things on how you are reducing bias in your experiment, or how you're making sure that your experiment is that only your independent variable is being tested here. So a good thing to always mention is I will repeat this experiment, or I will do this experiment 3 times. I'm going to make sure that I use eggs from the same species so that that isn't something that could potentially change the hatching viability. I'm going to use the same number of eggs in each salinity condition, and I'm going to keep all other variables constant, like temperature, light exposure, water flow, anything else that you happen to be doing in your experiment. Other things that you could potentially do here is kind of have an accompanying diagram here. So you could say, well, here's exactly how I'm going to do this. I'm going to have a cup with this solution and then this solution, and I'm going to put, 20 eggs in each one, just so that the reader really has a good idea of what it is that you are planning to do within your experiment. Word of caution when you are doing this: diagrams are great companions to your answer, but they cannot stand alone. So you can say, I'm going to be using these 4 salinities and reference your figure, but your drawing or your diagram cannot stand alone as far as getting points. So also something we talked about last week was the impact of human activities on biodiversity. So we talked about that acronym HIPPOC. So habitat destruction, the introduction of invasive species, pollution, human population growth, overexploitation or overharvesting, and then climate change. And we also talked about how those can have drastic consequences for the biodiversity of a particular area. That is true, but there are also natural disruptions. So things that just happen that can be as impactful as human-made disruptions. And over Earth's history, there have been lots of, on a global scale, changes that have done this. So tectonic plate movement has changed the face of the planet, has changed what the continents look like. There have been fluctuations in climate. There have been colder climates and warmer climates. This also is related to sea level change. So there have been times when there's been very high ocean levels and very low. And then there have been some really fluke kind of events like asteroid collisions. All of these things have impacted what species survived, where they moved to, and how many species were alive at any given time. So over here is just one example of how sea level change and the amount of glaciers present was different at the end of, or in the middle of, the last recent ice age and then today. So you can see that there's been a huge retreat in glaciers at the North Pole and a huge reduction in sea ice. So you will not have to necessarily memorize all of these different geological periods and eras and eons, but this diagram and diagrams like this are often used on the test. So it is a good idea to sort of be aware of them and recognize it for what it is. So just to kind of go through, because I'll be talking about these different time periods in other graphs later. So the most important sort of distinction here is probably at this break here, where you get into the Cambrian period. Everything before that is not as biodiverse as everything that happened later. So this is when we get the first sort of like explosion of biodiversity, all of these different animals evolving. So this is the Paleozoic era here, and it ends with one of the most significant extinction events. The Permian extinction event was the most impactful as far as biodiversity is concerned. I think up to 60% of living things at the time, or living families, died out. So here is the time of the dinosaurs during the Mesozoic. You've got another large extinction event that happened here. This is also often called the KT boundary in fossil records. That was because of course, asteroid impact, along with some other global climate change things. And then here we get into the Cenozoic area, and when humans sort of come onto the scene is about here, and then we've got the evolution of modern day humans about here. So notice that this is not necessarily to scale as far as time. So, this is 66 million years ago, and this is 4.5 billion years ago. So it's not quite to scale. So one of the things that has fluctuated dramatically over Earth's history is temperature. So kind of going back to those geological periods that we talked about, the the Mesozoic is right here. So this is the time of the dinosaurs. That's the Cambrian, where the Cambrian explosion happened. And then here we've got sort of like modern day. So you can see that compared to like kind of our global average temperature now, there have been some extreme shifts. So one thing to look at, though, is what happens here in the Permian. So there was a huge extinction event that occurred, and also a huge temperature shift as well. So when we look, the last million years or so, 750,000 years ago, there have been 8 big glacial periods that have happened. So over here, you can kind of see where the temperature's going up, and then it's going down, and then it's going up, and then it's going down. We are currently right now we have been at the end of an ice age. So here's our current temperatures now. And the concern in the future is a shift from this average. So this is sort of the projected 2100 temperature here. And you can see it's very, very high from the past million years or so. With these temperature fluctuations, there's also been changes in sea level. So this is an interesting map to me. This is sea level change at about 90 million years ago. And you can see right here, this is us in Alabama. And then you've got this line right here. This is called the fall line. And that's where this ancient ocean used to be. So even if you drive kind of south, you can go into these like low-lying areas that are kind of sandy and just pick up shark teeth off of the ground. And it's because at some point and multiple times, there has been actual oceans in this area. So why does this normally happen? Well, if you have increased temperatures in general, the glaciers reduce, the ocean has thermal expansion, which makes it, kind of larger than it normally is. And so when this happens, you can imagine that it completely changes the ecological characteristics of the areas that are around. So whenever temperatures increase in general, we always see a sea level change or a sea level rise. And so if we're getting warmer temperatures now, that's something that's going to accompany it. So another kind of thing that organisms tend to do in response to either human impacts or these natural disruptions is migrate. So you can have animals that are migrating slowly depending on an ecological change that is happening. Right now, we're having some really extreme and intense wildfires. You're going to see animals that have moved away from those areas into adjacent areas. But you also have migratory patterns that are important for the organism's life history. So we often think about this happening in birds, but whales are another really great example of species adapting to occupy different ecological niches in their life cycle. So for instance, these are the migratory routes of blue whales, and they have feeding areas that are at the poles where they spend their time eating and increasing their blubber. But then when it is time for them to reproduce, they will travel towards the equator to these breeding grounds. Here they will mate, they will have their calves, and they will raise them for many years before migrating back to their normal feeding ground. So let's get into some questions on these 3 topics. Question 1. The diagrams above show the range of tolerance for soil moisture content for 2 different species of terrestrial invertebrate, species 1 and species 2. The ranges represented are for each species where it occurs alone. Soil moisture content is a limiting factor for both species. If populations of both species are placed together in a new location, which of the following diagrams represents the most likely or actual range of the species distribution of individuals with respect to soil moisture content after 5 generations? So before we look at the answer choices, a couple of things to keep in mind here. We have discussed the difference between a species' fundamental niche, so like where they could actually occupy, so kind of like relating back to that ecological tolerance idea, and then where they're actually found because of other biotic factors like competition. Also, this is a hint that we're having some type of change over time or evolutionary adaptation to a change in an abiotic component. So up here, we've got the soil moisture content of 1 and soil moisture content of 2, and those things are very similar. So if we're going to look at the distribution of them placed together in a new location, we're going to have to consider what's happening with competition. So if these two organisms are competing with each other, are they really going to end up occupying the exact same moisture content level, the exact same niche? Probably not. That's also true for here, even if they are adapting to a different moisture content. So we're left with C and D. And of those two things, which sort of makes the most sense in the time that they're giving you, which is 5 generations? Is there going to be this extreme deviation, or will the niches somewhat separate, but there would be a small bit of niche overlap? If you thought it was D, yes, you are correct. So remember, evolution has sort of got its own constraints as far as how much a species can change over time. So we would most likely see these moisture content areas just slightly diverge. Question 2. 5 islands, A, B, C, D, and E, differ only in distance from the mainland area and species diversity. Which island would be predicted to have the highest species diversity? So this question is directly related to the theory of island biogeography. So if we remember the two important characteristics, large islands tend to be more biodiverse, and islands that are close to the mainland are more biodiverse. So let's look at distance first. Well, here A and B are the same distance. C is 500 kilometers away, and D is 1,000. So I'm going to go ahead and assume that means that they're not going to be as biodiverse. But we also have to consider area. So island A is 1 times 10 to the 2 hectares, and B is 1 times 10 to the 6. So this is our larger island that's closest to the mainland. That's probably going to be the island to have the highest species diversity. A student learns that microbeads, a type of microplastic, are very tiny pieces of manufactured polyethylene plastic added as exfoliants to health and beauty products such as cleansers and toothpastes. These tiny particles easily pass through water filtration systems and end up in the ocean and other large bodies of water, posing a potential threat to aquatic life. The student selects a small freshwater fish as a test subject for an experiment. Which statement below is the most likely testable hypothesis based on the information provided? So this is a really important thing to consider before answering, based on the information provided. That means that these answer choices are all going to be testable hypotheses, but only one is going to really be relevant to the information that they've provided you. So when the concentration of microbeads in water and the salinity of the water are increased, the population of the fish will decrease. Well, it does include the sort of experimental variable that we're interested in, but then it throws in this extra thing that wasn't mentioned. So let's keep that in mind. When the concentration of microbeads in water is increased, the population of fish will decrease. Okay, so that's a more in line with what they've already told us. Microbeads are threats to aquatic life, so we would expect the increase there to potentially decrease the fish population. When the concentration of microbeads in the water is increased, the population of fish will adapt and speciate. So that's something that, again, could potentially happen, but is the student really interested in whether or not fish can change over time in multiple different generations, or are we just looking at the potential threat to aquatic life? When the concentration of microbeads in the water is decreased, the population of aquatic life that feed on the fish will increase. Now again, this is a testable thing that you could set up, but this is an ecological question, a food chain question. So B is the most relevant to the information that was provided by the question. For which of the following reasons do large islands close to the mainland have a lower rate of species extinction than smaller, more isolated islands? Again, this is another island biogeography question. Large islands close to the mainland are less likely to receive more migrating species. Is this true? No. Large islands close to the mainland provide less opportunities for a greater diversity of species. Also not true. Larger area, more habitat, more space, more microclimate differences in the ecosystem that organisms could use as an available niche. Because of their size, large islands accumulate more species by chance. Now that is definitely true, but let's check D. Large islands have a lower availability of resources. Not true, because we know that from the species area curve. So because of their size, large islands accumulate more species by chance. Which of the following explanations is best supported by the data shown in the map above? So let's look at this map first before we start looking at the answer choices. So here I can see that we are following a lot of different bird species. And by the key, I see that we are looking at where they were in the winter a few decades ago, and then where they are in the winter more recently. I'm also given information on temperature changes in January as an average, and I can kind of see in general that the trend is the averages are slightly increasing. So let's see what's happening with the birds. I see that this bird here is moving north, this one is also moving north, and this one is moving north. So what I'm seeing here are populations of birds that are migrating due to the disturbance of a changing climate. So let's look at the answer choices. As mass extinction occurs, availability of niches allows species to change their range. Now this is true, but there isn't any information given here that there's been a mass extinction in these new areas that the birds are traveling to. Humans are introducing these species into new habitats as invasive species. Well, they are moving, but they are endemic to the area, so they wouldn't be considered invasive. Animals migrate seasonally to mate and to find food in different habitats. That's also something that birds do, but we can see we're talking about the same time period in their yearly cycle. So it would be different if they were showing us different time periods of the year. Organisms are moving their ranges as climate shifts occur. That sounds more like what's going on in this map. Which of the following statements correctly describes the trends seen in the data? So let's take a look at the data first. This is a map of temperature change over time, as well as telling us when there have been glacial periods over this time period of 550 million years. So let's take a look at A. The highest temperatures occurred during the glacial periods. Well, here's a glacial period, and it looks like both the short-term and the long-term averages were pretty low. This was a cold period. Same thing here and here and here. So that's probably not true. Glacial periods are usually followed by an increase in long-term average temperatures. So let's make sure I'm looking at the right thing. Long-term average, that's the black line. So here was a glacial period. Well, that was an increase there. Here's an increase after this one. Here's an increase here. and we haven't been able to see the uptick. So that sounds like that might be correct. The first glacial period began in the Carboniferous period, 325 million years ago. So here's the present, and if I follow it all the way back to 325 million years, that's around here. That is coinciding with the glacial period, but it's not the first one. Temperatures have steadily increased in the past 100 million years. So here's 100 million years. At first they went down, or I'm sorry, at first they went up, and then they went down. So that's not true either. So B is the most correct statement when describing the trends in this data. Which of the following explanations is best supported by the data shown in the map? So now we've got a different map of the United States and a different key. So this is snow goose data from 2010. It shows us the breeding grounds. It shows us the migration area. And then it also shows where their range is when they are not breeding, so their non-breeding range. Earth's climate has changed over geological time, and plates on Earth's crust have shifted. That's a true statement, but that doesn't have anything to do with this map. Wildfires have led to an increased concentration of wildlife in coastal areas as the forests burn. That may also be true, but we're not given any information in the map about that. Animals migrate seasonally to mate and to find food in different habitats. Okay, that might be our answer. Organisms are evolving each year to occupy different ecological niches. Now, that's also something that is true, potentially, but again, that's not what's being shown in the map. So C is our correct answer. Okay, let's get into some free response practice. The diagram below represents the pH ranges in which selected aquatic organisms exist. The solid figures represent pH ranges in which the organism thrives, and shaded figures represent pH ranges in which conditions are less favorable, but in which the organism survives. No symbol is placed in a pH range in which the organism cannot survive. Using the diagram and your understanding of environmental principles, answer the following questions. So before we get into that, let's really look at what's going on in the diagram. When we see a figure like this, that means that they are able to exist there, and they are able to not only just exist, but thrive. Here, however, their existence is possible, but they're not doing as well. So again, that's that sort of continuum of there's a pH range that's optimal, and then there's also pHs outside of that range, which they can tolerate, but it's not preferred. So A, identify the pH range in which brook trout thrive. To what range of hydrogen ion concentration does this pH range correspond? Explain why one of these organisms might best provide an indication that a lake has changed from pH 5.8 to pH 5.2. Explain how pH affects biodiversity in a freshwater community. Consider chemical, physiological, and ecological factors in your answer. Let's look at A first. Identify the pH range in which the brook trout thrive. So here's brook trout, and I'm looking for the figures that are completely shaded in because that's when they thrive. So that's this range here to this range. So about, a pH of 5 and a pH of 7. Now we also need to know the concentration of hydrogen ions that this corresponds to. So you would have gotten 2 points here, one for the pH determination and one for the range determination. So the pH in which the brook trout thrives is, like we said, 5 to 7. And that corresponds to a concentration of 1 times 10 to the negative 5 to 1 times 10 to the negative 7. Now, how did we get to this answer here? So maybe if you remember from chemistry, pH is just the power of hydrogen, and it is equal to the negative log of hydrogen ions, concentration of hydrogen ions. That also means when you rearrange it, that the concentration of hydrogen ions is just 10 to the negative pH. So if I have a pH of 5, right, that is equal to 1 times 10 to the negative 5 hydrogen ions. And I had a pH of 5 here and 7. That is how this was determined. Now, this is even easier now because the exam allows you to use your calculator. But again, this is very simply done just by remembering what pH actually means. Explain why one of these organisms might best provide an indication that a lake has changed from pH 5.8 to pH 5.2. So now we're looking at an indicator organism. So you get 2 points, one for identifying what that organism is, and then for explaining why you would use that. So again, let's take a look at this diagram. So I'm looking at a range of 5.8 to 5.2. So let's make sure we're looking at the correct part of the graph. So that's maybe about right here to right here. So this is what I'm looking at. When I go from this column to this column, what really changes? Well, rainbow trout, the crayfish, and the mayfly. Those things have disappeared in that range of pH shift. So 1 point for identifying any of those indicator organisms, because that pH is apparently outside of the range of ecological tolerance for them. Now, why is that useful? So you basically have to explain why you identified those. Well, for the mayfly, they thrive down to pH 5.5. So here they were doing really, really well, but over as it decreases past 5.5, then you have a disappearance of that from the ecosystem. The crayfish and or the trout, they survive down to pH 5.5 and then disappear completely below that threshold. Last part, discuss how pH affects biodiversity in a freshwater community. Consider chemical, physiological, and ecological factors in your answer. So you kind of have to remember here what pH is really telling us about the water quality. So a really low pH means that it's really acidic. So within the context of the diagram, as the pH values decline, we saw that more organisms were unable to occupy that pH in the water. So the biodiversity decreased. Also, as acidity increased, the biodiversity decreased. You could also state this in the opposite way. As you increase pH, biodiversity increases, or as you decrease the acidity, biodiversity increases. So why might aquatic organisms not enjoy being in very acidic water? So a lot of our toxic metals, which you'll learn about in the units that cover pollution, are released in solutions more easily at lower pH. They just are dissolved in those things. So especially things like copper, iron, lead are more soluble in lower pH water. Those things are toxic to living organisms. Also, increased nitrogen levels from nitric acid that could cause those algal blooms that we've discussed previously, and that would really affect the dissolved oxygen levels to the point where those larger organisms don't have enough oxygen for cellular respiration. This could also reduce the rate of reproduction because it could negatively affect the eggs themselves that are laid in water. You also could have food web disruptions because you've got pH-sensitive organisms that are dying, and so now the organisms that rely on them as a food source have less resources. Other things that are important here, you could also just talk about the fact that, we know acidic solutions can be very damaging to tissues, skin, scales, eyes, all of those different things. All right, that concludes week 6. See you next time.
All right. Thank you, ma'am. I think that went well.